Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into a new episode of Capitol View, a weekly webcast brought to you by the Daily Journal and djournal.com. Coming to you every Monday about 2 p.m., talking about the state government with Bobby Harrison, our Capitol Bureau Chief down there in Jackson. I'm your host, Brad Locke. Thanks for joining us for the next 12, 15 minutes. We've got a few things to talk about, Bobby. It's the dead of summer. I think I mentioned this last week, Bobby. We're well removed from the session, and we don't have another one for a while, but always something to talk about in there.
Yeah, always something to talk about. And right now, we're learning more about state revenue collections, and so I think we're going to talk about that some.
Let's do that. Indeed, we just recently started a new fiscal year. And so, the numbers come in, will be coming in here about how we did for fiscal year 2017. And we know it's been rough here in Mississippi, Bobby. And a story you had Sunday about corporate tax collections. Been a lot of tax breaks for businesses in Mississippi under this administration, Phil Bryant. And so that appears to be one of the big causes, if not the big cause, Bobby, for the state revenue that continues to lag.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can just look at the numbers and make that argument, make that assumption, and it'd be hard to argue with. I mean, just as I think you got the numbers in front of you, but I'm just looking at them here, Brad. And in FY 2015 we just finished. Keep in mind, we just finished FY 2017, but in FY 2015, the state collected $714 million in corporate tax revenue, which was almost 13% of the total general fund revenue collections. But at the end of the just completed budget year, the state collected $564 million, which was less than 10.5% of total state revenue collection. So I think it's safe to assume that the action they've taken over the past several years has led to the amount of money contributed towards the overall maintenance of state government, the amount contributed by corporations, by businesses and whatnot, has gone down significantly. Now more of the responsibility for funding state government rests with other entities other than corporations, businesses, and then the people who oppose some of those tax cuts would say a lot of those corporations that got the big tax cuts are out-of-state companies that would be in Mississippi whether they had the tax cut or not. I mean, we're talking Walmart, JCPenney, sure, and companies like that.
Yeah, during the 2-year span you just talked about, fiscal year 2015 through fiscal year 2017, Governor Phil Bryant has signed into law almost 50 tax cuts, taking about $300 million out of the revenue stream. Most of those tax cuts are for businesses. So, Bobby, is it a pretty, I know you can manipulate numbers to make them say what you want sometimes, but is it a pretty easy correlation, pretty direct correlation you can make between the corporate tax collections being down and the revenue struggling?
Yeah. I think it's obvious. I mean, I think the correlation is there. Just looking at the raw numbers. Now, granted, I mean, sales tax, personal income tax, none of them is doing great right now. But the biggest drop off has been in the corporate income tax collections, and that's where the bulk of the tax cuts have gone. And as you know, Brad, the biggest tax cut in the state's history was passed in the 2016 session, and that hadn't, but it's going to be about $435 million over 10 years, and the phase into that begins this fiscal year. So I mean, so this and at the beginning of it, all of the tax cuts are going to corporations again. So that's going to be more, that's going to be more money being taken out of state coffers to reduce the tax liability for businesses. So that's coming in this current budget year and the ones to follow. So we see this trend continue unless something dramatic happens.
Well, of course, the people who support these tax cuts, Bobby, will argue that this is a small window of time we're looking at, 2 years, and that you just have to have patience that this will ultimately result in a stronger Mississippi economy. I know change doesn't happen overnight, especially something the scale of a state economy, Bobby. But I mean that's. I guess, as the old cliche goes, time will tell whether they're right on that or not. Then at some point, we're going to know for sure, I would guess.
Yeah, that's the argument they make. The Republican leadership, that's the argument that these tax cuts will eventually lead to economic growth and an increase in state revenue from other areas because of the economic prosperity. And so we'll see if that's, as you said, we'll see over time whether whether that happens or not.
And of course, we have this kind of transition into the what we want to talk about as far as this general fund sweeping of fees and such into that general fund. There was a legislation passed in 2016. I have to read it because it's a mouthful, Bobby. Just to get it right, the Budget Transparency and Simplification Act, which is apparently neither simple nor, depending on who you talk to, transparent. Very complex piece of legislation. It's supposed to sweep certain fees that had gone to specific agencies just into the general fund. So, one argument from the pro tax cut crowd is that the government got more in total receipts for fiscal 2017 than the previous year. So that kind of again. And we'll get into the what that really means, but I guess that would be one pro, or at least one argument on their side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what the end of the budget year on June 30th, what it shows is that sweeps legislation you referred to provided $125 million in additional revenue for the general fund.
Right.
And that helped to offset the reduction in corporate taxes that we've been talking about. And plus, as I stated earlier, the personal income tax, sales tax collections also have been sluggish. And if it wasn't for that $125 million from the sweeps legislation, the state budget would be in a real mess. Now, some people would argue that it is already in a real mess, despite that sweeps legislation, because what the sweeps legislation does, it takes the money that had been those fees and assessments you referred to that had been designated for particular programs like the Victims Compensation Program, and puts that money in the general fund to be divvied up by all state agencies. But the Attorney General's office is still responsible for administering and doling out money for the Victims Compensation Fund. So they just had to find money from other sources to do that. So that puts their budget in a sort of a terrible mess. And so it's kind of kind of a catch-22, but the legislature can say revenue has increased, and this mess is not caused by us, even though some people would argue it is caused by them because of the tax cuts we've been talking about. But the sweeps legislation will provide the state about $125 million per year in recurring revenue to help offset those tax cuts to corporations and to other entities.
But as the critics say, Bobby, they view this as nothing more than a shell game, just moving money around.
Right.
Because again, these fees and assessments don't go to these agencies; they got to figure it out on their own. And we're seeing lots of agencies make big cuts. And so I don't know, Bobby. I guess it depends on how you just want to look at it.
Yeah, of course, the Speaker Philip Gunn and others say, this is what they were elected to do to reduce the tax burden and to reduce the size of government. So they say they're fulfilling their legislative promises by doing these things. And so we just had to see, in the next round of elections in 2019, whether those are still popular positions or whether they've gone too far with the cuts and reductions in taxes. So we'll see how that goes in 2019.
Yeah. The argument. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we're going to go back to that same old cliche. Time will tell.
Well, that's true, I guess. But the supporters of it say that their argument is that it's a more efficient use of this money, and it gives lawmakers more say into deciding agency spending levels. How does it work now, Bobby? If an agency needs that money they used to get, how do they go about getting it, or do they?
Well, they have to go to the legislature and make the case that they need that money worse than Medicaid or education or another entity needs the money. And over the past couple of years, most agencies have undergone 10% cuts or so in general fund collection in general fund appropriations. So they're like the Attorney General's office is having to deal with double-digit budget cuts in general funds. Then at the same time, they had to make up for the loss of the fees and assessments to pay for the Victims Compensation Fund, for the fund to train district attorneys, a fund to there's about 9 funds that the Attorney General's office was receiving fees and assessments to operate that they're not getting now. Secretary of State's in the same boat. Several agencies are having to do that. And a lot of agencies, as you said, have eliminated programs and cut back on employees. The Department of Public Health has had to make some significant changes and lay off some people, and so has the Department of Mental Health. And I think the Forestry Association, the Forestry Commission has had to do the same, and it goes on down the line.
Well, let's switch gears and talk about sort of related, a possible new revenue stream, sports betting. Now, Bobby, there's actually some legislation was kind of quietly passed this past session that could bring sports betting to Mississippi's casinos, but right now it's not legal, but it could be. Bobby, there's some movement in the courts on that front, isn't there?
Yeah, as you recall, Brad, during the session, legislation was passed to regulate and ensure that fantasy sports betting, fantasy sports games are legal, and that's where have these leagues where you pick your quarterback and defense and based on how the individuals you pick perform, you win or lose, and in doing that, they also, no one talked about it at the time, but they legalized sports betting at casinos, where you could go into a casino and bet on the Patriots to win the Super Bowl and all those things that you can do in Las Vegas now. Right now, Brad, it is illegal nationally to do because of federal legislation for casinos to do that outside of Las Vegas and a couple other places. But the Supreme Court is hearing arguments on that this year about whether that law should be revoked to federal law. And because of what the Mississippi legislature did during the 2017 session, if that federal law is found to be unconstitutional or whatever by the Supreme Court, then it would be legal in Mississippi casinos it would be legal for Mississippi casinos to operate sports booking, sports betting, to allow betting on sporting events at their casinos. So that would be a big deal. And the people who passed that legislation, the legislators who passed the legislation, say they were just trying to ensure that fantasy sports was allowed because that was the goal of the legislation. And when they passed the legislation, the Supreme Court hadn't even agreed to hear that case yet. So they said they had no concept that at some point the federal ban on allowing casinos to operate these sports booking, sports betting parlors, or as you will, would be reversed. So they were not trying to do that when they passed the legislation, but that's going to be the result of that legislation. So so we may have that in you can go to Tunica and bet on the Super Bowl or the Final Four or in basketball or the World Series or all those things if the Supreme Court overturns the ban.
It's illegal sports betting is about $150 billion per year industry. I mean, that's a lot of money. And I know New Jersey is kind of taking a lead on this, aren't they, Bobby? I mean, it's home of Atlantic City. It's been a gambling mecca for years. And I believe New Jersey had a law struck down by a circuit court as part of this process, right?
Right. And that's actually the case has made its way to the United States Supreme Court. And, most experts believe the fact that the Supreme Court even agreed to hear the case means there's a good chance that they're going to strike down that federal law and allow states to allow their casinos to allow betting on sporting events.
All right. Good stuff, Bobby, as always.
Be bad for a neighborhood bookie, Brad.
I guess so, Bobby. Good stuff as always. You can read Bobby's work, of course, each day in the Daily Journal and online at djournal.com. Give Bobby a follow on Twitter at BobbyHarrison9. That'll do it for this episode of Capitol View. Again, coming to you every Monday, 2 p.m. at djournal.com. If you don't catch it live, just watch the replay later in the day. So that's it. We'll be back, I guess, next Monday, Bobby.
All right, Brad. Appreciate it.
See y'all next time.
Yeah. All right.